Hey guys, welcome back. This is Code Realm. My name is Alex, and in this tutorial I'd like to introduce you to Material UI. We're going to build a simple React application. It's going to be a simple CRUD application built in React, and we're going to be using Material UI as a framework for styling. So if you don't know, Material UI is basically a UI framework that provides a bunch of different isolated and independent components or React elements that can be used as building blocks for building more complex user interfaces. So the UI components themselves house all the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript built into them. And the cool thing about those components is that they can actually be used independently without any dependencies on external libraries like normalized CSS or jQuery or anything like that. So first things first, I'm actually on Code Sandbox.io, and I decided that I'd be using this environment as the local setup for coding. And the first thing we'll do is let me just refresh the page, and just when you land on the page, you're going to see this button, Open React. If you click on it, it's basically going to bootstrap a simple React application, and it's actually going to be based on Create React App. So out of the box, we get a full setup. You can see we have a public folder with index.html file. This is going to be the only HTML file in the project. But we also get this index.js, which is basically the entry point of the application. As you can see here, we've got a basic setup. We've got an app component, and it's being rendered to the DOM using React DOM, as you can see here. And we also have the hello.js, just a simple functional component for demo. And of course, you can see package.json here. As you can see, this is basically just a normal setup with everything that you would expect. We have React dependency, React DOM, as well as React scripts. And in fact, if you look over the dependencies here, you can see that we've got all of them in there. Now on the right, you can actually see the output. So the cool thing about this cloud setup is that whenever we change something, let's actually change the text over here. So let's say hello from Code Sandbox. You can see that as I actually type, this is being hook reloaded on the right. So everything that you basically type is going to be updated almost immediately on the right. And there's a few other options as well. You can integrate it with GitHub. You could actually download the whole setup, all the files yourself. So it's pretty flexible and it's pretty cool actually. If you click on this button over here, open a new window, you could see the application running in a separate window. You can actually expect it and see all of the different components over here. So for instance, you can already see the app component. We've got all the other markup as well. Now the first thing I'd like to do is we're going to be using Material UI. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look for Material UI in Google, and it's going to be the first thing that pops up in the search results. Now for this demo, for this tutorial, we're actually going to be using Material UI Next. So Material UI Next is the very next version of Material UI that is coming up very soon. And in fact, if you click on the icon over there on GitHub, you could see the project on GitHub as well. You can find some documentation here as well. Now, if you click on releases at the top, you're going to be seeing a bunch of different versions that came out recently. Now, as you can see, there's quite a few versions based on version 1, and they have a bunch of different release candidates. But in fact, the fact of the matter is they actually have a stable version 0.20, I believe, or something like that. And that version actually been around for quite some time. Here you see right there, 0.20. I think it probably was the latest release for that branch. Now the next branch that's coming up, as you can see here, is the next branch. Now the next branch contains a rewrite of the library, and in fact there's been quite a few changes in it. So one thing, for example, they went from less to CSS and JavaScript. That was one change that they did in terms of styling, but they also rewrote a lot of the components, a lot of the UI elements as well. Now, like I said, the version 0.20 is the stable one, and it's probably the one that you would typically see in production when this library is being used. But we're actually going to be looking at Material UI Next, because this branch, the next branch, has actually been in development for several years now. And this is the branch that's going to be coming up in the future. So the future is now, it's coming up. So we're going to be using the very latest and greatest features of the library, of the framework. Now with that out of the way, let's actually go back to the docs. And if you can see here at the top, you're going to see a small paragraph. If you click on that text over there, you're going to be redirected to materialuinext.com. So we're going to be using that website. Be sure to use that link specifically, because that's where the documentation resides for the correct version of the library. Now click on Get Started, and you're going to be redirected to the main page here on the installation page. So what we need to do in order to install the libraries, we need to run npm install with the save flag, and we need to install Material UI and specifically the next branch of the library. Now what we're going to be doing here is, well, first of all, let's save the file. Okay, we just forked the repository, and what I'm going to do next is I'm going to click on dependencies and I'm going to add the dependencies. So search for Material UI. Okay, now the very first thing you see in the list is basically the framework that we need to install. But make sure to click on the drop-down box. Make sure to select version 1. Now at the time of this recording, the version is 1.0.0 beta 34. So that's the one I'm going to be using, and I just click on it and it's just going to be installed. It's going to take a couple of seconds in order to install, and the project is going to resolve all the dependencies itself. So, okay, now we're actually going to get to coding right now. The kind of application that I'd like to build with this setup would be a simple fitness application, because I'm actually, just besides of coding, I'm also into fitness. So we're going to create a simple exercise database with this application. So it's just going to be a simple normal CRUD application in React. You're going to be able to add, modify, delete, and view exercises. So it's sort of like similar to the to-do application you would typically build, but it's just going to be a little bit of a different concept, and we're going to be using Material UI for the UI elements as well. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Preferences, and in the editor what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to disable Prettify. The reason I'd like to do that is because, well, there's actually several reasons. If you click on the prettier settings, there's actually a few things you could do. So for instance, you could disable semicolons at the end of statements. You could also use single quotes. But what I noticed is whenever I save the files, it tends to indent them in ways that are not necessarily congruent with the way I would like to style them. So I'm pretty confident in my skills, so I'm going to be using my own styling. Of course, it's completely up to you if you want to enable prettifying. In fact, you should probably enable it because it's a good guide. It's just basically a good guide for you to indent your stuff. So use it if you'd like to, but in this case, I'm just going to disable it. And I'm also going to replace all the semicolons. That's just a personal thing that I like to do with my projects always. I don't use semicolons, and we're gonna clear up this just a little bit. So I'm gonna just have a simple div here. You can have the app component. Let's also put some text in there. So I'm just gonna say hi from React. Okay, so let's say that. Now there's no import for the hello component. In fact, I'm just gonna delete it. Okay. This is basically the clean setup that we have. So the first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to create a new folder. I'm going to call it components, and I'm actually going to create the app component in there. So I'd like to move the app component from here actually to the component file itself, to the module. So what I'm going to do here is let's import React from React. That's the first thing we have to do. Next, I'm going to export default a function that's going to receive the props, even though we probably don't have any props, but it's just going to be an empty, an undefined actually, okay, an empty object. And we're going to indent this a little bit, and this should be good, I think. So we can import app from components app, okay, save that. As you can see, we get the same output as before. Right, so what I'd like to do next is I'd like to actually have a header at the very top. And for the header, we're probably going to be using, so back in the documentation, if you click on component demos, you could see the list of all the components that are present in the library. So the very first one I'd like to use is the app bar component. So it's just going to be a navigation bar. We're also going to have a header, and we're also going to have the main content, obviously. But let's begin with the header first. So I'm just going to create a subfolder. I'm going to call it layout, and let's create a header file. In fact, it's going to be very similar to what the structure is in app.js. I'm just going to copy it over, and here I'm just going to say I'm going to have a div with h1. I'm just going to say header, okay, for now. Let's also create a footer, like I said. So I'm going to create a footer. Let's go to that module. All right, so in footer.js, I'm just going to paste the same thing. I'm going to put the footer in there, and let's go back to app. So the thing about the app component, I created it as a functional component, but I think what we're actually going to do is we're going to have our state reside in the app component, I think. So I'm actually going to convert it to a class-based component. So I'm just going to do an export default class. It's going to be an anonymous class extending the component from React, and of course we need to import that as well. Let's have the component, and in there we're just going to have the render method. We're going to return some markup. Okay, let's have a div. In fact, I'm going to put a fragment in here. Now, for those of you who don't know, the fragment is basically a component in React that allows you to have an outer wrapper for your elements. So the problem here is, for instance, let's say I have two elements. So I have an h1 tag, and you should probably know this by now, but I'll just explain it anyways. And you have some text in here in the paragraph. Now, what if you wanted to have both of those elements at the same time? Now, of course, that's not possible, right? So you need to have a wrapper basically for those two elements. So one thing you would typically do is you would have a div, and of course then you would have a closing div. But in some scenarios, you might also want to have just a wrapper that doesn't actually include any markup. So this div will actually be present on the page. So you have your body tags, and then inside of your body you have the div that contains the h1 tag and then the paragraph below it. In this case, if you put the fragment, the cool thing is the fragment won't actually include any markup in and of itself. So it would just simply have the h1 tag and paragraph directly below the body. That's why I'm going to be using the fragment, and of course you have to import it from React. I'm just going to save that, but in this scenario I don't want any headers or paragraphs. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to have the header, and this has to be capitalized, of course, otherwise it's going to be treated as a normal header in HTML. The header is actually a valid element in HTML5. And of course we need to import a header from, let's see, we need to go to components, layouts, and then the header, and the same thing I'll do for the footer. So the footer needs to be imported from layouts. Okay. Oh, my bad, sorry. The components is actually not necessary because we are in the components folder, so let's save that. There we go, we got the header and the footer, and then we're also going to have the main content. So what I'm going to do for the main content, all of the business logic is actually going to reside in, let's call it exercises folder. And the one thing I'll do first though is, as you can see here, we have the header and the footer. The only thing here is that the path is actually duplicated and it's a little bit redundant. So what I'm going to do is in layouts, I'm actually going to create another file, and I'm going to call it index.js. And in index.js, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to import header from header. Okay. And the same thing I'll also do for the footer. And what I'm actually going to do in this file will not do anything extraordinary, except it's just basically going to import the header and the footer using default imports, and it's also going to export them from the module. And why am I doing this, you might ask? Well, instead of having the two imports of the header and footer separately, because these are default imports, and we have to have actually two separate statements because these are two separate modules. But now, because we added the index.js file, what I can do now is I can actually import the header and the footer in one line using the named import. I can just simply say go to layouts, and that's it. I don't need to use the header or the footer postfix afterwards. And I can just save that, and it's going to work. The way it works, just to clarify, I mentioned it several times before on my channel as well, in other projects, but basically the idea is once you go to a folder in this case, well, first of all, it's going to look for a layouts.js file, right? Under components, but there's no such file, so it's going to look for the folder. So it sees, okay, we've got the layouts folder, let's go to that folder and let's go to index.js, because it's actually going to look for the entry file index.js, and it goes in there, imports the two components, and then exports them using named export. And once we've got that, let's go back to the exercise. What I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to create a new file. Let's also call it index.js. And this file is actually going to house all of the business logic. So we're going to import React from React. We're also going to export defaults, a function, props. It's going to accept the props, and it's going to return some markup. For now, I'm just going to have a div with a closing tag. Let's say hello from exercises. Okay, let's say that. Let's go back to app.js, and I'm also going to import exercises from exercises. Now, I don't need to use a named import in this case because we are actually doing a default export, okay? So we don't need to do that. And of course you could adjust it or change it to your needs, so you might actually use a named export if you'd like to, but I'm just going to keep it that way for now. So what we have here is we basically have a very primitive rudimentary setup that allows us to have a header, the main content of the page as you might expect, and as well as the footer. So what we're going to do from this point is we're actually going to use this skeleton in order to build out the application.